Thank you, Melissa. Welcome, everyone. With us today, again, is Barbara Kelly, CEO and President of the California Technical Assistance Center on PBIS. She is presenting the third in a series of 3 webinars, Using Data to Address Intensive Individual Student Needs. We had 2 previous webinars, and if you haven't had a chance to see them, I highly recommend them. The first webinar, Effective Use on Data for School-Wide Decision-Making in PBIS, was on March 18th. And the second one, Effective Use on Data to Address Equity Issues in PBIS, was on April 28th. Now, these previous 2 webinars, they're not quite up yet, but they will very, very shortly be posted, archived on relwest.wested.org. Okay, so the goals for today, we're going to explore a data-based inquiry process to identify and effectively address individual students' socio-emotional needs. And we're also going to learn from our presenter and each other to support ongoing efforts in understanding and addressing school climate issues. Here's the agenda. Again, our focus today is on using data to effectively address a student's individual needs. This is an opportunity for you to interact with your colleagues and to tap into Barbara Kelly's expertise. Again, as Melissa mentioned, please type your questions and comments or links to any resources you may have in the chat area. Really, the best material tends to come from the participants, from you all, so please be sure to insert any questions or comments you have. And it's a pretty small group, so if you have any questions, we can sort of interrupt and sort of insert your questions right away as they come up. But there will be also some time set aside to sort of to get your feedback then as well.
So we're going to be talking about the Tier 3 interventions and using data for decision making. And as we get started, throughout the state and actually across the nation, we're just really at that point with PBIS that we're really embarking in this Tier 3 world, looking at it as our final frontier. So we like to use the metaphor of Star Trek because we are boldly going where a lot of our teams have not gone before, where we're looking at teams actually doing assessments and creating behavior support plans that come from the general education side and not just special education and not relying only on an outside evaluator. So the outcomes really that I'm going to be talking about today is how to explore the steps of creating a simple functional behavior support plan and then using a progress monitoring tool. So we're going to engage and get moving. I'm glad you all figured out how to use the chat room. I'm going to open mine up because it got closed again. Because I'd like to begin some participation with asking you to think about this synecdoche or metaphor, however you want to call this activity, and think about Tier 3 interventions and progress monitoring are like Star Trek because. If you'd all think for a minute, how would you finish that sentence, and then type that into the chat room for me. I like that. Karen says, we're going where few have ventured before. And I don't know, there might be some of you out there at your middle schools where your gen ed teams have been doing this work, but in my experience as I move around the state, having our general education team so involved and their behavioral experts really acting as in an advisory position is fairly new. So it does require that we begin to look at our jobs differently. We want to help the students help themselves, and so much as possible honor the prime directive, but still do positive things. Absolutely. You remembered the prime directive. There's somebody else out there that knows about Star Trek. So when we talk about looking at Tier 3, even more than or at a deeper level, we make sure that we're looking at the ABCs of behavior. While in PBIS schools, the ABCs of behavior are what we use even in our Tier 1, it defines our Tier 1, Tier 2, and really now our Tier 3 work, because we're always looking at what can we do to prevent the behavior, how can we be positive with what it is that we want kids to do, how are we teaching them the behaviors we want them to have, and how are we really aware of what the maintaining consequence is. So when we move into our Tier 3 work, we're making sure that we're really clear on what is the antecedent, what is the thing that triggers that misbehavior that we're so concerned about with a student who needs a Tier 3 intervention, and what is the maintaining consequence for that misbehavior. And in the work that we're doing, we use a model. I'm just going to introduce it to you. There are many of them out there, but this seems to be the only manualized, evidence-based practice that we have found for working with developing behavior support plans, a simple behavior support plan. And it's called Prevent, Teach, and Reinforce. So I'm going to go through just setting the stage for what we're talking about when we're working with Tier 3 interventions. And we're making sure then that we really determine what the payoff is. What is it that's in it for the student? What is the result? What is the maintaining consequence for the behavior? So many of you, I guess I should ask a question right now. How many of you are really that familiar with understanding how you create a hypothesis statement on an individual student level, where you're looking at the idea of the function of the behavior? So if you could type in right now, if this is really familiar to you, the idea of understanding the function of misbehavior. Okay, I have one no so far. Yes, I heard it, but this is new to me. Okay, so I'll go a little bit deeper in this so that you understand what this chart means. It's really that when we're working with a student at the Tier 3 level, we really need to be able to have a pretty high probability of making the best guess at why a student is doing their misbehavior. And it's either about obtaining or getting something, or it's about trying to escape or avoid something. And so most of the assessment that I'm going to talk about is really trying to determine that, so that we can then build a plan that has a better chance of being successful because it's meeting the needs of the student. Effective implementation of Tier 3 interventions that are looking at behavioral assessment and creating a behavior support plan really need a team that's committed to successful outcomes for the student. And while that sounds like a no-brainer, that's what we're really working on, sometimes the students that need these Tier 3 interventions, we're looking for what can we do, where can we have them go, where is another environment that will be successful for them. And the key here is that we're really committed to trying to help the student be successful in the environment that they are currently in. It really requires that there's a fidelity of implementation. We must implement with fidelity to the model, otherwise we'll be looking at it's not working, the student has more need than what we can provide, when in fact it really may be that we didn't implement with fidelity and have complete understanding of the behavior.
Hey, Barbara?
Yeah, I see that question. I think it's from Tom about how do we know whether the behavior is motivated by the effort to get or to avoid. So I'll give you an example. It's part of the assessment process. So if you're in Tier 3 work, there needs to be someone working with you to help you with the assessment process. But an example would be a student who throws a knife across the classroom. And they could be throwing that knife across the classroom because as soon as they do that, the teacher is going to come over, start working with them, calming them down, seeing what they can do to help them. Maybe instead of a knife, let's choose throwing a chair, because a knife automatically means something else. Let's say they threw a chair in the classroom.
Okay.
Where I've been lately, so we'll talk about a chair. So they threw the chair across the classroom, and they could be doing it because they have learned that when they act out like that, when they, whatever their typical behavior is that they do, that they get attention from the adults, or they'll get attention from the peers. So what you do is you watch to see what happens right afterwards. And if they do it again and the same result happens, then that's probably about getting attention from the adults. If they could throw the chair across the classroom, and what happens is they are then get to escape doing their assignment, they're asked to go to timeout, they're sent to the office, something happens to where they avoid the assignment, or it could be that they still do the assignment, but they avoid doing it as a group assignment and they get to work on it themselves. So what they get out of it is kind of your biggest clue. about what the function of the behavior is. But there are really specific guidelines and questions that you ask so that you can increase the probability that it's, because it's always still a guess. We're not really in kids' heads about what the function of their misbehavior is. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
And so it really leads into that third bullet there, is it really depends then on the capacity of the team members. So in a Tier 3 team, it's really important that there is someone on the team with behavioral expertise. Doesn't need everybody needs to have that, but that there is somebody on the team that can help guide the participants with the types of questions that will lead you to better understand the function of the behavior. It's also really important for effective implementation at the Tier 3 level that you have the availability, the involvement, and the support of the school administrators. Many times, the behavior plans that we might come up with a student who has Tier 3 needs are going to require some restructuring in the school, and having those people that can make the changes as part of the team is really important. Tier 3 teams also need to have family involvement. Depending on the age level of the student, you would also have the student involved. From middle school, maybe even later secondary, 5, 6 through middle school and high school, you certainly want to have the student involved, and that also depends on the developmental level of the student. But definitely the family would be involved. And then we're also talking about wraparound services because quite often students with Tier 3 needs need more than just a behavior support plan. We need to have that in place so we can help them begin to be more successful within their educational environment, but oftentimes they need more support as well. They might need support to the family. They could be students that are having to go home right after school because they're also babysitting. Or it could be that the family needs some financial help or they need some parenting skills. There's lots of different interventions that students might need where they will be more successful then with the implementation of their behavior support plan. So when we're talking about Tier 3 interventions, we're really looking at it being a team approach. And those of you that do this work are really familiar when we talk about a school-wide team, a targeted group team, and a Tier 3 team. What becomes very different about the Tier 3 team is that team's constantly going to be shifting about who's on the team. There'll be a couple of members that are constant because they understand the process and maybe have the behavioral expertise. But the team itself is always built around the student, the identified student. So it's those people that are working directly with the student that will make up the majority of the team. So you're always going to have to make sure that that team's got some basic elements down of how to function as a team, such as having those good team agreements, and that you've set up your team meeting dates and you're very specific about what you're going to do with those meetings. We have found that when we work with Tier 3 interventions and students who need those interventions, that the more specific you can be and the more sticking to your agenda that you can do so that your meetings last only 45 minutes to an hour, because you'll need multiple meetings when you're talking about a Tier 3 intervention, the more effective you're going to be. If you end up getting meetings that are an hour, 2 hours in length, you'll lose your efficiency and your effectiveness of the team. So it's really important, and that's why we have, and I highly recommend that you look into this if you're thinking about beginning a Tier 3 intervention. I'm looking for the books as I'm talking to you. The Tier 3 intervention called Prevent, Teach, and Reinforce, because like I say, it is a manualized process, and it really helps lay this out for you. The authors are Dr. Glenn Dunlap and Rose Ivanov, in case you're looking for that. But it's a really good tool to use for schools. Sorry, I moved away while I was looking for that and didn't speak right.
No problem. Hey, Barbara, there's a question from Karen. Is this a separate team, or is it, can we sort of repurpose SST team or something? You know, it sounds like, I guess I thought it sounds like there's some core group, but there's also members that are specific for the student.
Right, and in our experience, we're finding that more of the targeted group, the at-risk student, ends up really being part of that SST process, and that the Tier 3 often comes out of the SST. It's like a step up from that, and will involve maybe some of the same people on the SST, but you certainly have to have a higher level of behavioral expertise that sometimes doesn't always sit on SST meetings. And the approach is different. Part of that is that you really focus on the strengths and needs of the student, and that you'll discuss what the student needs. And sometimes that conversation becomes a little difficult because you'll be then start switching it to what are their disabilities, what are their problems, what's getting in the way, what's wrong. And we don't want to go that way with the conversation, so it takes a fairly skilled facilitator. And one of the ideas behind that is you can start focusing then on what is it that we need to do in order for that student to be successful. So here's an example of creating the student strengths and needs chart, so that you're going to talk about what are their social strengths, what are their academic strengths, and then also what are their social needs and what are their academic needs. When you move into the Tier 3 interventions, once you have been really trying to establish what the function of the misbehavior is, then you're also going to be identifying or operationalizing just what is that problem behavior. So you'll have the group of teachers, if it's a middle school student, talking about what they find to be the misbehavior, and the facilitator needs to help them, what we say operationalize, meaning what would you see and hear when that student is doing that misbehavior. And this is a really big step that we have found in the work for the gen ed teachers when they come together, even if there's a special ed or a resource teacher involved with the student, to reach this kind of consensus about what is the biggest thing, what is the biggest problem, what is the thing that if we worked on that, we might see everything else come together. That conversation is very rich, particularly when the parent is with you as well, and at different times that we've had the student with us when we've been talking about what is it that's getting in the way for their learning. And then the next step is you really want to make sure that you are establishing a long-term life goal. So we're looking at a much bigger picture. What is it that we really want for the student? What is it that will make the student really successful in life? And then from that, we will take a look at what are 3 broad goals. What's a behavior goal for that student? What's a social-emotional goal? And what's an academic goal? So you can see that when you're talking about Tier 3 interventions for students, it's much more significant than any of the work that we did at Tier 1 and Tier 2, and why it's so important that our school-wide interventions and our targeted group interventions are strong and really in place, because we need very few kids that need this type of intervention. So there's no easy trick to this. It does take an intensive approach when you're working with kids that have this level of need. Once you've identified those 3 broad goals, what it is you think you want to work on with the student, the next step is really then operationalizing what behavior is it that we really want to decrease. So now we're going to get really specific. So if we had a broad behavior goal, that the student was going to be able to stay in their seat and complete assignments during all academic classes. So what we would want to operationalize is then what are we going to need to see him decrease in order for that to happen. So we're going to need to make sure that he is decreasing the amount of time that he's staring off into space. That all teachers agreed that was the one thing that always sets it off, begins our problem when he sits back and starts staring off into space. So then we're also going to decide what is it that we want him to do. So now we want him instead to look down at his paper, give me a signal, I'm going to come over and start getting him started, because we have figured out that he does that in order to get my attention. So I want to teach him a new way to get my attention, and that's going to be to give me an appropriate signal. That's just an example of how to do that. And then we're also going to see what social-emotional behaviors is it that we want to increase. So it might be that he needs to learn how to ask for help instead of do the staring off and wait until somebody comes over to rescue him. And academically, what is it that we want to increase? So again, we're taking a broader scope and a bigger look at this student in order to help him. So when you do that, we have to have some way of measuring whether or not this is working for us. We have to see if we can measure, is what we want of this student, is it working, the new behavior, and are we decreasing the old behavior? So the way we do that in Tier 3 is by looking at behavior rating scales. And these are very easy to create because they're very dependent on the student. And I'll show you how you create them and the idea behind them. So this is kind of the backbone of measurement, progress monitoring for any Tier 3 intervention for students. So this particular student, we wanted to increase his task engagement, and we wanted to decrease the tantrum or the problem behavior. So earlier on, we really operationalized. What would you see in here when that's happening? So task engagement meant he's remaining in his seat with his eyes focused on the teacher and or his work materials during independent academic work time. So we're not tackling his whole day. It was only during independent work time, and we're only looking to see that he is either looking at the teacher or on his materials. So we got very specific in our conversation with what we wanted to increase. Then we wanted to decrease what we called tantrums. And what that meant is we only counted a tantrum when he actually is screaming, kicking furniture or people, and throwing objects. And we decided all three of those have to be present in order for us to score him on that. So then I'll show you how you develop the scoring system here in a minute. And I'll pull these up here, but the reasons that we want to collect data, it's important for us to progress monitor data when we're doing individual student interventions, because we need to make sure that the student's challenging behavior is the one that should be targeted for the intervention. I mentioned earlier during that assessment phase when we're talking with all the teachers, they'll come in with varying ideas of what needs to be targeted because they have them for different subject matters. He acts different. You've got different personalities involved. But what is something that we can all agree to together that we want to be able to do for the student? And Noelle is saying that she's still concerned about the safety of other students in the class. So when you have a student that needs Tier 3 interventions and it's a violent safety issue, after you have gone through what I'm going to show you when you develop the plan, the final step is to make sure that you have a safety plan if you need that. Not all students in Tier 3 interventions need a safety plan, but if there is a requirement for one, you make sure that it's added, and that's really the final step when you're developing the plan. You need to make sure that the intervention strategies are effective in decreasing that student's challenging behavior after the implementation. Yeah, so let me remind you of the tool. It's called the Prevent, Teach, and Reinforce. And the author of the book is Glenn Dunlap. There's a group, but Glenn Dunlap, and you'll be able to find it. Being a manualized approach, it really does explain all of these steps that I'm telling you and gives you it just will walk you through it. With the supportive behavior specialist, you'll be able to do it easily as a team. Well, not easily. It takes effort. I'll be honest with you. It does take effort to do the Tier 3 type of work. The other reason that we need to collect...
While we're interrupting, so I'm kind of confused. So when are these observations and the data collected? You know, with the rating scheme that we had 2 slides ago. I mean, I'm sort of unclear sort of when we do that.
In those team meetings, when I said you have a specific agenda that you do on the team meetings, the first agenda of the meeting is to gather the teachers together, and the assessment is there. So it's the questions that you lead those teachers through that helps you determine what is the problem behavior that we're going to reach agreement on. This is the problem that we're having. And then you begin to ask the questions about when is it happening, where is it most happening, who is it happening with, and you begin to collect that data in the team meeting. So it's really an interview process with the teachers. If you don't feel you're,
mhm.
yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. So this is when you had the slide with the behavior rating scales, and there's a date and there's this task engagement, and it looks like you sort of repeatedly rate, you know, those
Right.
things, the tantrums.
Right.
Are we talking about the same thing? So that's what I was wondering. I mean, that involves the student, right?
Right. So you'll do that at two levels. You'll first decide what it is you want to collect data on and how you're going to collect that data, what type of a schedule, and I'll show you the different types of schedules here in a minute. And then you'll do that as a baseline, and then you'll work on your intervention plan. You'll do the intervention plan, and then you'll do it as a progress monitoring tool. So there's two steps to using that.
And that's like a sample of time in a classroom or something like that? Or that's to be determined by the group?
That gets determined by the group, right.
Okay.
Right. Most of the time it will be, we're talking middle school, so it will be during a class period. And you'll be looking at, let me get to those because that'll make more sense when I tell you the types of scales and how we develop them.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay.
That's okay, we'll get there. And then you want to make sure you're collecting data because you've got to see if the goals of the intervention plan are actually being met and if we need to make any modifications along the way so that we begin to see the progress or lack of progress, and we need to go back and take a look at the plan and see what we can do to modify it to try to be successful. So one of the things, this is what Tom was leading into, is when you develop the behavior rating scale, how do you know what it should be looking for? Which metric is best? Are we going to be looking at behavior because it's something that happens a lot during the period? What bothers us the most in teaching is that it happens constantly. Or is that it doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, it's 20 minutes of class? Or is it not so much that it's 20 minutes of class, but it is so big it stops everything? And so it's more a look at the intensity. So it's part of that process at the team meeting that you look at what is it about this misbehavior that's causing us our most difficulty. And so when you develop the behavior rating scale, you'll use, I'm going to go off this slide and show you what the scale looks like. It'll make more sense. You'll use so let's talk about task engagement. We want to increase that skill set of eyes focused on the teacher or on his work materials. And so currently, the little arrows, our goal is that he's going to be able to do that for 10 minutes. That's what we want to work on. Typically, right now, he can only do that between 2 and 4 minutes. So this is different than when you have a behavior specialist come in who's going to tally things in a 30-second intervals and see how many times things are happening. This is really a simple behavior support plan based on the teacher's perceptions of what's going on in their classroom. So that right now, most of the time, he can stay engaged at that level for about 2 to 4 minutes. Our goal is we want to get him to 10 minutes. Then we're looking at what is the behavior that we want to decrease. And so the problem behavior is that we wanted to decrease those temper tantrums, which was the kicking and the screaming and the throwing of objects. And so currently, his typical day is between 7 and 9 times. That's how often he's doing that on a typical day. Our goal for him is that we would like to get it to 0 or 1 per day. So for this particular one, it was a daily look, and this up here was within minutes. So obviously when we talked about his tantrum behavior, it was how many times during the whole day. So you'll set this metric up based on what the problem is that's being presented for the child. That's why it's always different. The behavior rating scale format looks the same, and you'll always set up when you're trying to increase a behavior you want to see. The typical day goes in the number in the second here, the number 2 row, because you want to increase that to your goal. So you would want to go the 3, the 4, and see an increase. When it's something you want to decrease, the typical day number is set on the 4, and then a really bad day is the 5, and the direction you want to go goes down to the 1. Let me show you some examples. This particular one, we're looking at our anchor point. We're deciding it's about frequency. So this is the number of times during the day that there are problems with those misbehaviors. So you can see the 5 would mean it's extremely bad. The 4 is it's a typical day. A 3 is good. A 2 is better. And a 1 is we've met our goal. So we want to, excuse me, we want to decrease a misbehavior. So our typical day goes on the 4 line. So you see where we have the 8 to 9? That was the typical day. A bad day was 10 or more. A good day was 6 or 7. A better day was 4 or 5. And our goal is to get down to between 0 and 3. And this is something that we would want to adjust as time goes by. So we might do a plan change because in 2 weeks we see that we've got them down to 0 or 1 for our goal. And then we would adjust these numbers for our anchor points. So another type of behavior rating scale would be the duration. So this now can be looked at percentage of day, or it could be looked at the second rundown is looking at the number of minutes, how long it lasts. So it's the same idea. Mm-hmm. When you create your scale, you will take your typical day, what's the percentage of time this kid is physically aggressive, and you'll put that number on the 4 line where that little lightning bolt shows up. And then you'll make it the worst, it's the bad days are 40 and above, and then it gets a little better when it's 21 to 30%, better than that at 10 to 20, and then 10%. So you see how you use the same process, but the internal makings of it always look different because it depends on the information the team comes up with when they're working with the student. Here's an example, the same idea, but now we're looking at number of minutes, how long it lasts for the duration. And again, the typical day for this particular student is 8 to 10 minutes, and that's why it's listed on the 4. Are there any questions on how you set up a daily point card? Because that is the backbone to progress monitoring for Tier 3 intervention.
I think I'll speak for myself, and then we'll see if anybody types anything. I think I understand the idea is that you sort of want to create a threshold, so that you capture the variation, so you can sort of detect improvement in whether you've reached your goal. And once you've reached your goal, you kind of you change the metric. It sounds like. I guess my question is who is collecting these data? It seems like it's hard. I mean, it seems like it's a pretty intensive data collection.
Well, I just finished this with a team, a high school team, and every teacher, this particular student only has 4 periods during the day. It's a block scheduling school. And all 4 teachers are collecting the data on a daily basis. So they have a card that looks similar to this one in front of you, except it's not talking about the playground. And it's for the whole week. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are on their card. And then each day at the end of their period, they just give a circle on where they think he is. How did it go for that period of the day? It's really not that difficult to collect this data. It's actually quite easier than a lot of other things that kids carry around and ask teachers to comment on during the day. And what makes it easy is that the teachers created it, and they all reached agreement, and they all know how to do it before they get started. So it does make it easier than it seems, because I'm just giving you this really quick overview of how it works.
Okay.
Okay. So again, the same idea. We came up with intensity here, and it was either ear-piercing noises or greater than playground voice, or just a playground voice. Better than that is an inside voice, and then finally it's soft. And I don't know about the whimper. I'm not sure we want to teach kids how to whimper or squeal. Soft might have been nice. So now we're talking about increasing. What is it that we want the student to be able to do? So now it flips. Our typical day is on the 2 line because we want to see our chart go up. So when we were decreasing behavior, we had it on the 4 so that we would hopefully see it go down to the 0. Well, now we want to increase the behavior. So our typical day will always be on that number 2 line. So here is that we're wanting them to use his words. And typically now he uses 4 to 5 words. We want to improve that to where he's using at least 10 words per day. So it's an example of how you use frequency. This would be duration, so we're talking about percent of time. So again, this is on-task behavior. We're saying on a typical day, this kid is on task 40 to 55% of the time. And we would like to see it increase to more than 80% of the time. Intensity, this is talking about a student with misbehaviors, and our typical day is that to get what he wants, he kicks or hits. And we would like to move up. I'm not sure verbally threatens is a good idea either, but using words might be something we want to say there instead of verbally threatens. And then moving up to being able to negotiate, and then moving up to being able to take turns. So it would mean that the plan was actually teaching these behaviors, and we're going to measure to see if he or she is able to implement them. And then across different settings. The same idea of this is the accounts that we can do if we're looking at being able to measure an academic skill. So the daily point cards can be used to measure anything that we're doing with a student, whether it's improving academic, a social skill, or a behavior skill. You just have to be able to figure out what's the typical day, what's going to be the metric that you're using, and then have the teachers be able to collect that data on a daily basis. There's a count again. So here's an example. There's kind of a chart that talks about the misbehavior with Johnny's misbehavior, and we either want to decrease that behavior, and we can be looking at decrease meaning the frequency or the duration or the intensity, or we want to increase a new desired behavior, and again, is it about the frequency, the duration, or the intensity? Once we determine those, then we'll ask ourselves what's the typical day, and we can plot that on the behavior rating scale. So since assessment is our prime directive when it comes to looking at Tier 3 work, there's a question here. Oh, so I like using the green and red for a quick way to see. Absolutely. We discovered that in our trainings. It doesn't come that way in the book, but highly recommend it. It's a good visual that we're trying to improve something or trying to decrease something. It seems like there's a lot of pre-work before schools can collect and analyze this kind of data. Can you give me a little bit more information on what you think the pre-work is before schools can? I don't know if you're talking about the work that the team does around a student, because it does take the team, in my experience, to meet 2 times before you actually can begin implementing a plan to see how it's working. So I don't know if that's your... Oh, getting the teachers to agree on the metrics. It actually doesn't take that long. The longer part is really helping them agree on what it is that the misbehavior is, that they've operationalized it, really have a clear understanding of what it is that they want to do. I just did this last week, and a teacher came in solid with what he really thought the problem was, but as they talked about it, it clearly wasn't that, and he even had to realize, yeah, it isn't that, but it took a while for him to be able to give up what he came in wanting to have done. So the metrics really fall in line right after you've really been able to operationalize what is that behavior that you want to decrease, and then what is it that you want to see that you want to increase.
Barbara, did you see Karen's question? Is the student ever involved in collecting the data or monitoring his own behavior? And then do you collect this behavior data at home?
So the last one is easier to answer. Yes, you can collect the data at home. That depends completely on the team and what it is that you want to do. And you might even have the metric look a little bit different in that the behavior itself might be different than what the parent is dealing with at home. But yeah, definitely you can do this at home, and particularly because the parent's been in the room with you during this process as much as possible. I mean, we all know there are times that just isn't always a good idea or probable, but whenever you can, you want to involve the parent. The other question was about the student, and yes, that would be part of once you've met your goal and you want to increase the effectiveness, that you would be handing that off and giving a gradual release for the student to begin to monitor themselves. So one of the last slides is showing how you use database decision, looking at your data about what you want to do to adjust your plan, and that's one of the things, is how you involve the student. And you can involve the student in the assessment because, particularly if you're talking about upper grades, they're in the room. When you're asking, what do you think the problem, what is it getting in the way for you, they're part of that. So yeah, you would want to involve the student. Again, depending on the developmental skills of the student and the age. So part of the assessment that you're talking about is getting us all on the same page about what is the problem behavior. What is it really happening? What is it that we need to teach the student to be able to do in order to get their same need met? And how are we going to make sure that we are giving consequences so that we understand the function of the behavior? So the work that the team does is to answer a series of questions about the prevent data, that's really identifying what is the misbehavior and when is it happening and where. Then they're also going to be collecting data that will lead them to make a pretty good educated guess about the function of the misbehavior. And they're going to take a look at what is it that is reinforcing that behavior, what happens right after it that's part of the problem. And you'll establish these patterns, you'll have everybody's opinions, you put them all up on a wall together, and this is kind of an example of what it might look like. And when you put it up on the wall and say you're talking about the consequences, and one teacher says, well, he's sent out for timeout. The other one is he's allowed to stay in art and stay in the music classes. He's able to delay upcoming activities. He's sent to the behavior specialist. You begin to see a pattern that looks like avoidance. So when you get everybody's voice in the room, you really will most often see a pattern, or you'll see that the student uses the same misbehavior for two different reasons, depending on what the situation is. So part of the process is the gathering of that kind of data. So when you gather that data, what you end up with then is your hypothesis statement. So you're looking at when this happens, then this will happen, and as a result, the student's getting or avoiding, so that you then can build your behavior plan around the function of the behavior. And you'll be able to collect the data to see if what it is you want him to do is increasing and what it is you want to decrease is actually decreasing. Once you begin that process, and the first part of the data collection is now going to be baseline data, because we haven't had that kind of data around that specific problem. We've only been talking about what his issues are. So now we're going to collect data to see if we're really on target with what we thought were going to be the biggest problem areas. Then we're going to be meeting back, and that all happens in the first team meeting. The second team meeting, now we're going to be taking a look at, based on the function of his behavior, based on our hypothesis statement, what are some prevention strategies that are recommended for kids whose function of behavior is about getting? What are some prevention strategies that are for students whose function of behavior is around avoiding? And these are evidence-based practices that then address the function of behavior. This is just an example of a few of them that are in that Prevent, Teach, and Reinforce book. So you'll do that for the prevention strategies as a group. Then you're going to select only one of those to work with. Then you're going to take a look at the teach strategies. Which of these are most appropriate for what it is that we want to teach him, because it has to make sure that it meets the function of his misbehavior. So if we have a student who is avoiding assignments by having a temper tantrum, then we want to make sure that we're picking a strategy, say a self-monitoring strategy, that's going to teach him how to avoid that moment in a socially appropriate way, but able to come back and start doing his assignments. So we have to pick something that's going to match the function, but still keep him engaged with school. Because right now, he's picking a behavior that disengages him from school. Then we want to look at what our reinforcement strategies will be, and what are we going to do that we feel will help motivate the student to do the replacement behavior. Not only is it going to work for him, but why is he going to want it to work for him? And again, we're only going to pick one, and the power behind this is that all the teachers, you're at a middle school, so all 6 teachers are working on the same misbehavior, providing the same language and the same recognition and the same acknowledgement system for him, making sure they're taking care of the triggers that typically set him off, so they've got a better chance of being successful. And it's quite powerful when all of this happens at once and the student is really aware of what's going on, and that they're a part of solving the problem. This is, I think, the biggest part, because those strategies are nothing. If you were able to look at a few of them, and if you look in the PTR book, they're nothing new, nothing fancy. It's the idea that we're doing them with fidelity to how they were developed. But the other part that makes it successful is that you want to make sure you're taking a look at answering these questions and whatever you come up with to prevent part of your plan. So when you're looking at the antecedent parts, what you're going to do to prevent the misbehavior in the first place, you're going to ask these questions that are here. So whatever system you use when you are developing a plan for a student, these are great questions to ask yourself. Are there any additional materials or resources that you need? It's terrible to get into this type of an intervention and realize you don't have the bell you needed at the moment you needed it in order to give the kid a reinforcer. And so these are good questions. You can take a look at them, and I believe you all have the handout with these questions as well. The same idea when we're talking about teach. What are the questions we need to answer to make sure we're prepared to implement the plan? Again, these are more significant plans, so we need to be prepared for them. And then also talking about the acknowledgement system. Again, some questions to just answer to make sure we're prepared to implement this plan. Another item that I have in the past failed to do is to really do a task analysis. So we've decided we're going to do 3 things in the prevention strategies, or we're going to teach 2 skills. But did we really make sure we knew how to teach it? Do we have all the things that we needed in order to do that task? Do I really understand what it means that the student's going to look me in the eye while I'm talking? Do we all know what that means so that we're doing it together? The last part of this, I was just going to show you the Swiss data, how you then take those behavior rating scales and you enter them into the school information system for individual students. And what it will do is it chart those scores for you very easily on how well they're meeting their overall goal for the entire day. And then you can also then break that down just by a certain time period. So here's an example where we're looking at rate of disruption. It was perfectly designed. We now only wanted to take a look at it at lunch recess to see if that looked any different than before. The last part is just this decision-making tree, that when you see positive behavior change, and this is what Tom was talking about earlier, how do you extend your plan so that it's generalized to other settings or to other interventions? How do you shape it? The other idea is how do you begin fading reinforcement, which is building in delayed gratification or putting them on an intermittent schedule? And then how do you build in self-management? So that's when you're successful on the plan. And then when you're not, you want to make sure that you're looking through this process. When it's not improving, did you implement it with fidelity or not? Was the plan too difficult? Was it not a match? Did we begin strong and then lost our way? looking to see if the hypothesis is correct, or if we need to, the hypothesis is correct, but our intervention was insufficient. So again, these trees just help us when we take a look at our data about what we should do next with the student. And then we need to ask those questions about if we implemented with high integrity or fidelity, did we adhere to what the plan was there quality in that? And then I was going to end with a reflective conversation, but we have like 2 minutes left.
Yeah, we do. We do. Did you, there's a couple comments. Noelle said, I really like the way this model encourages people to build and not just suppress. I guess that's where the P in PBIS comes from.
Right.
And then Karen asks, how do we align what is happening with Tier 1 and 2 on a school-wide basis with what is being done on Tier 3? Oh, gosh.
We have time. I can give you an example of that. Again, this was at a high school, so not a middle school, but we were doing a Tier 3 intervention, and planning the intervention plan, when we looked at the effective evidence-based practices that we chose, the teacher said, oh, that's easy because I already have my Via Vaquero. So I'll use the Via Vaquero at a 5-to-1, and I'm going to make sure I do that for all students. And another teacher said, well, you know, that one behavior is my matrix. It's on our school-wide matrix, and I've not been addressing that. So I'm going to address it for the whole school and then very specifically be able to target it for this one student. So they easily tied it into what they were doing already with Tier 1 work.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you, Barbara. That was a great presentation. And it followed perfectly from the other two. We're out of time right now. If anyone has any more questions, you know, you can continue to put them in the chat.